Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to, of course, another album of the week. This, of course, is episode number 87, and this is also the very last Metaltober 2020 led album of the week. And what better way to at least what album to pick, of course, to end off the last Metaltober 2020 led edition of album of the week. Then, of course, with the debut album from, of course, the legendary UK Thrashers. That's Onslaught with, of course, Power from Hell, which was originally released in 1985. Now, I definitely want to kind of go off. I mean, I could have also picked their second album, The Force, which is probably my absolute favorite album from Onslaught. But before you get to at least say the follow-up, you kind of have to start off with the first. And Power from Hell is definitely a great record in my opinion. I mean, yes, it's at times pretty sloppy, but it's the one of those main reasons. It's the album's charm for sure. For me, it's why I like the album to begin with, and of course it took me a few years to really appreciate this album to begin with. It wasn't a complete favorite from the beginning, but now I love it just as much as I love The Force. But to get in, of course, the lineup is a little different. Of course, the main vocalist on this album, of course, is Paul Mahoney, who is the bass player for the band. And he, for the most part, he does sing the album, and his vocals on this record, obviously, it's, I wouldn't say Lemmy-ish, but there's definitely a very it's very similar to, of course, mostly UK punk at times. Discharge is actually the one band that definitely comes to mind. I'll get to a lot of other comparisons between this album and, of course, Discharge in general. But it's somewhere between, again, the vocalist from Discharge and Kronos from Venom, and of course a little bit of Dash of Lemmy. But those are probably the two I really can draw comparisons, because again, it's very guttural and very shouty at times as well. But it works in the album's favor, and especially the delivery of this whole album to begin with. It works. But besides Paul Mahoney, who is, of course, sings the majority of the album, because this is before they got Cy Keeler in the band. But still, besides Paul Mahoney, one of the founding members of the band, which is Nige Rocket, he at least does sing at least 2 songs on the album, which of course were the tracks Death Metal and The Devil's Legion. Death Metal a little later I'll definitely get into a bit, mostly because of other at least the confusion between the tracks Death Metal from Onslaught and Death Metal from Possessed, and the confusion of which track came first. So I'll definitely get into that a little later. But still, let's still keep focusing on the sound of this record, which again, the best way I can really also can just describe the sound of Power from Hell. I mean, again, this is a very raw recorded album. Of course, the same as goes for, of course, the follow-up, but that one definitely was a little bit more, I guess, better produced compared to this, but that still isn't saying much. But again, that's not why we even like some of these 80s thrash metal albums to begin with. But they're trying to really just to describe the sound of Power from Hell. It's basically the best way I can describe it is basically of bands like Venom, Slayer, and Discharge all got into a complete barbaric brawl. That's the best way I can describe this, because they are just absolutely going at it like there is no fucking tomorrow on it. And with these and then the thing where I really draw also between Discharge, Venom, and Slayer. I mean, when it comes to Slayer, you can't really compare this to any of the albums that Slayer at least released at this time period, which again, they already had Haunting the Chapel and Hell Awaits, and then a few year later, there will be Rain and Blood. You really can't draw the comparison to that. I draw more comparisons to the very first record, Show No Mercy, which again, I think Power From Hell has that combination between the more new wave or British metal influence that you kind of heard on Slayer's debut, and again on the Slayer's debut, you hear more of that British metal influence, and you really hear the more of the straight up thrash assault that you really would kind of get. I mean, it's thrashy, but it's more, again, at heart, it's got more British metal, more classic British metal leanings to it. Again, more so the new wave of British heavy metal. Again, this is where you also can draw the comparisons with, of course, Venom, mostly, again, like Welcome to Hell and black metal, and of course that War of Satan. You kind of hear some of more of that influence, and of course also here and there maybe Tank, Warfare, and Avenger, and some of those kind of bands, and of course Diamond Head. You really can hear the influence of that, but in its delivery, it's a more punk-led delivery. That's where we start to draw the comparisons to Discharge, which to me, I've always kind of thought Discharge was at least the one band that kind of the missing link between the combinations of like metal going from punk. You know, that of course, which leads to the whole startup of thrash metal. You kind of, I felt like Discharge were like the missing link in many ways. If you weren't familiar with Discharge, or at least are familiar, you probably would at least know what I'm saying. Of course, you would at least know what I'm saying. Definitely Discharge were, again, of all the British punk bands, or just punk bands in general, they make at least most US hardcore punk bands sound like The Clash, and even also make their UK band Sex Pistols sound like the Rolling Stones, and which making John Lennon probably the punk equivalent to Mick Jagger. So Discharge was like literally the absolute definition of absolute fucking anarchy, and that's what I think Onslaught really kind of draws from. They draw a lot of that anarchistic attitude, and of course that hard bringing in some of that new wave of British heavy metal influence, and that's what ends up getting concocted on this album, and of course conjured and again just all risen up. This is what you come to at least hear on this record, and again, it's that raw fucking absolute brutality of at least the delivery on the sound that's great. I mean, not really as brutal as you probably would get on The Force. Of course, nowadays the term brutal means something different now, but for at least the time period of this time, this was still very heavy, raw, fast, guttural shit for this time. And again, it's why I like it. It's to me a great album from Onslaught. Again, I also forgot to run down a lot of tracks on the sound. I mean, there's some great songs on here. I mean, from, of course, the beginning, which begins with, the intro, that very demonic almost intro of Damnation, to, again, of course, getting into the track Onslaught, Power From Hell, which in many ways is seen as like the title track of the album. And it's if it's heavy, fast, and raw, and just in your face, and it works for the album's favor, and it definitely sets you up of what you're going to expect with this album. It's great. Then, of course, from there we get classic tracks like Thermonuclear Devastation, Skull Crusher 1, Lord of Evil, Death Metal, Angels of Death, The Devil's Legion, Steel Meets Steel, Skull Crusher 2, Witch Hunt, and of course, the very last track, which is Mighty Empress, which now I at least I should briefly talk about this one. The Mighty Empress track, it's not really an actual composition from Onslaught. It's actually a symphonic piece, a piece that I've heard in films, TV shows, commercials. It's been used in about everything, and I've got the Metal Archives up. This is where I actually found, at least the Metal Archives is the only site here that actually mentions of what the piece is. It's basically, it's an excerpt from of Fortuna Imperatrix Mundi Fortune Plango Vulnera, which is, again, it's according to Metal Archives here. Yes, it's, at least I'm taking it from here. So if you at least know more information about this track, and it's not by this guy, let me know. It's according to Metal Archives, it was by Robert Shaw. So that's, of course, the piece. So it's already a I don't know if we can say it's a public domain piece, but it is definitely a very familiar piece, and it was lasts for at least 50 seconds. It's probably a longer, symphonic, piece, traditional piece, but they at least use some of that to kind of end the record. And at times, I feel it's a little excessive, but at least at this time, it probably was to make them feel as evil and dangerous as possible, which was kind of one of the key factors about a lot of these thrash metal bands at this point, whenever they would take on the Satanism kind of characteristics and just ideology and all of that. Again, gimmick, it was to make them seem like they are evil, to at least also rebellious towards a lot of the Christian groups who were very much were bad-mouthing a lot of metal to begin with and rock. So this was more so was a way to kind of seen as rebellious than really something as they wanted to be as serious. It was more, again, kind of seen as kind of a middle finger. And then of like, yeah, this is what we really want to pursue, unless you're King Diamond. That's only a reason you probably would take it serious. But that's pretty much it. Now, finally, let's get into, of course, the track Death Metal, which I did mention. I mentioned about the confusion. Ever since this album was originally released on 1985, it was released on a punk label, which, again, I should have also mentioned this earlier. It was released on a punk label, which was Children of the Revolution Records, which was a UK-based punk label that definitely, again, it specialized a lot of punk, but it did have, of course, bands like Sacrilege and even The Accused. And, of course, in the US, it was released through, of course, Pusmort, which, of course, also was also kind of a punk label anyways. Let me Pusmort. The band that label's most for having is Attitude Adjustment and Septic Death. Those are the only two bands that were familiar to me. So they were on the labels that released the album in 1985, and so at the same time. Again, Onslaught had the track Death Metal on this album, and of course, if you looked at the back cover, it's also even on the top of the pentagram, which again, in type Death Metal. However, at the same period, you also had Possessed with 7 Churches, and there was a song on there also called Death Metal, and Possessed are, of course, were considered, and are still considered, one of the earliest death metal bands, and one of the bands that really kind of, in many ways, came up with the sound that would become, death metal. They were the ones that kind of created the sound, kind of like how many people view Black Sabbath as creating heavy metal in general, or at times also being one of the originators of doom metal. Still, though, it's kind of seen, but the thing is, both these two bands had a track called Death Metal at this time. And if I'm also correct, I think even the band Volcano even had a track called Death Metal. But don't quote me on that, okay? Do not quote me on that. That's probably wrong. I cannot be sure. It's been a while since I've looked at the track listing for Bloody Vengeance from Volcano. Still, though, let's just focus on Onslaught and Possessed. And the thing is also, prior to of course, their 1985 debut records, both Onslaught and Possessed also released demo tape, or at least a demo tape, in 1984. Both their demos in 1984 also had the tracks Death Metal. And again, they're different songs. They're absolutely different, but still they just share the same name. So it's kind of confusing on it, or at least it's been kind of confusing for those to kind of figure out which track came first. Was it Onslaught or was it Possessed? If you personally ask me, it's like the same. To me, it's no different from when people are trying to, look at Napalm Death and Repulsion and are trying to look at which band came first, and in which, again, they're both crowned for being the originators of course, that would be grindcore. And so some were kind of putting out, so which one came first, which band, Repulsion or Napalm Death? If you ask me, just the way I view the bands Repulsion and Napalm Death, it's the same thing I look at when it comes to, of course, Onslaught with the tracks death metal from, again, Possessed and Onslaught. I think they both came first. They both are tied. They both coined the name death metal. Of course, in 1984, Noise Records also released their split LP that had Hellhammer, Running Wild, and Halloween, and of course Dark Fairies, and that split record was called Death Metal. So I think in many ways, everyone at least kind of came up with the name death metal in general, from Noise Records to, of course, Onslaught and Possessed. So they both, all of them at least, should be given at least kudos for coming up with the name. And in many ways, Onslaught might also be considered one of the influential, because of Paul Mahoney's guttural style vocals on this album. They're almost are kind of close to being almost death metal-ish at times. At times, maybe more so than Jeff Becerra of Possessed. Still, though, they're trying to come up with who came first, I think, is a little bit ridiculous. Yes, it might be interesting for a debate, but really, is it really that much of a point, really? Is it really that worth it? I think it's pointless, to be quite honest, to try and to come up with a definitive answer on which one came first. I think they both were the same fucking time, so basically, you have to just crown both them the gold. Give them the fucking winning title for at least coming up with the name death metal, instead of trying to give one title to one fucking band. I think that in many ways, it kind of defeats any of the purpose and what they kind of achieved to begin with. So that's my honest opinion on all of that. So again, this is to me, definitely a great record. Of course, since then, they definitely have tightened up their sound. I know this year they had released a record as well. I know Night Rocket definitely is still continuing with Onslaught. Again, like I've stated, they did release an album this year, which I have not even get to even listen to. Is it even good? Is it great? Still, though, we're still just focusing on Power from Hell, and that's where we're going to end things. That's a great album from Onslaught, and definitely, again, just a great album from them in general. So with that, what were your thoughts on this album anyways? Especially on the time when this album came out. Were you there when this album first came out? If you did, definitely what were your thoughts when you first heard it for the very first time? And if you end up hearing it later on in the year, I know Combat Records did release it in the US also, or at least repressed it in like 1987. So many of you at least could have at least gotten chances to at least hear Power from Hell. So what were your thoughts on this album? If you haven't even heard Onslaught, this album or The Force I think are definitely good beginners. They're definitely raw. They're not really close to being more so the US style thrash metal, especially like Slayer, but it's still worth checking out. I still recommend checking out Onslaught. If you like thrash metal in general and you haven't still heard this band, any of these two albums I think are good albums in general. So with that, I hope y'all enjoyed, and I hope y'all enjoyed Metaltober in general. So with that, this is Every Thrash. I say I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.